extreme graphic content such as torture, blood, gore, dismemberment, hatred, vengeance, impalement, burning alive, crushing, defiling, and much more. If none of this is your liking, then you are advised to walk away now. You have been warned.
Cheerilee's Garden.
The entire theater complex was abuzz with the voices of 100 excited ponies. As Cheerilee peeked out carefully from behind the curtains hiding the stage, she saw rows upon rows of ponies sitting in the stands or moving between them, talking to each other as they waited or tried to make one last trip to get some food and beverages before the show. She glanced quickly to the left and saw the musicians had already set up in the orchestra pits in front of the stage. They'd only be needed for a few scenes, but Cheerilee was still glad to have them. Seeing such a big crowd gathered there made her a bit nervous, even though this had all been her idea. Almost all of the seats were taken, and Cheerilee knew there were barely enough to accommodate the entire population of Ponyville. The show would be subjected to the scrutiny of many pony eyes indeed. She retreated back behind the curtains, hoping nobody saw her. She had felt that would have been somewhat unprofessional. Everything seemed to be in order as she inspected the stage for the last time. All the props and the equipment were beautifully made, straight from the hooves of the masters. Cheerilee had only needed to tell them what she wanted, and they had provided it without any questions, even though certain items must have seemed unnecessary. After all, they didn't know what she had in mind for this night, while she did. She was quite sure some of their props would make even a professional theater jealous. The stage was divided into sections, each denoting its supposed location. This way, they didn't need time or backstage ponies to change the decor after each act, cutting down on the time needed for the scene change. Cheerilee was a big fan of this system, as it meant that there was one less thing for her to worry about. She turned back and headed for stage left, where her students were busy getting all dressed up. It was a total chaos, with bits and pieces of costumes scattered across the room like sprinkles on a cupcake. At the center of this mess were the Cutie Mark Crusaders, as Cheerilee had come to expect. The fact that none of them had sprouted a making trouble cutie mark yet surprised her more each day and every day.
Hey, that's my helmet!
Scootaloo told Sweetabelle accusingly.
Yours is way over there.
No, it sure isn't,
she replied as she lifted the knightly helmet off her head and held it out for Scootaloo to inspect.
This one has a hole for my horn, see?
Are y'all sure it ain't my helmet?
Avalum said as she scratched her head.
The king wears a crown!
The other two snapped back. Cheerilee sighed as she had quickly glanced at her other students. Silver Spoon and Diamond Tiara seemed to progress orderly, if slowly, mainly due to how they constantly flourished and admired each other after every article of clothing they put on, and after every single brush of their mane. Snips was to her great surprise, ready and waiting. The fact that Snails was backstage on tech duty might have had something to do with that, she mused. She remained confident that they'd make it in time, as she had had a great foresight to start them all on preparations much earlier than anyone would have thought necessary. She had come to know this little group throughout the months. She had prepared for almost anything. Nothing could possibly go wrong today. She had put too much planning and work into seeing it all fail now. She smiled as she envisioned the peace, quiet, tranquility, and relief she'd feel when all of this was over.
All right, students.
She chimed.
Let me just run you through the steps one last time.
There was much groaning to be heard across the room, but Cheerilee was not taking any chances with this bunch.
If you still have a part to play but aren't needed on set, come back here. If your role is all played out, exit the stage on the other side. You'll be able to watch the rest of the play from there. That is, if you didn't see it enough already.
She paused for a moment to ascertain everyone was still listening, and they all nodded.
If the pony you're playing with skips some of your lines, don't try to correct them. Remember, we may notice if some pony doesn't follow the script, but the audience won't as long as you keep the dialogue flowing.
The fillies and Snip nodded again, and Cheerilee smiled at them.
Good. Now get ready. I have to see the opening of the show, so be ready and on the set in no more than 10 minutes.
She walked away as the young ponies got back to it, and Cheerilee thought they seemed to quarrel and delay slightly less this time, though that was probably just her imagination. The last one she had to check up on was Snails, whom she put backstage due to his absolute inability to even the most basic of acting. All he had to do there was listen for certain cues and then carry out one specific action. She had even written all of that down on a list that was easy enough to follow, even for him. Up to this point, he'd done okay during their practices, but you never knew. She gave him a few reminders, and he reassured that he wouldn't let her down, all while wearing that idiotic grin of his. Cheerilee sighed as she went back to the main stage, resigned to the fact that she'd have to leave this one up to fate. She was pleased to see the other ponies already gathered and in position when she got there, all of them sitting around a U-shaped table, the open end to which pointed into the direction of the crowd. Applebloom was dressed up as somewhat of royal descent, a shiny crown on her head, and a regal mitten floating down her shoulders. To her right were the remaining two Cutie Mark Crusaders, both dressed in exaggerated versions of knightly armor. Sweetie Belle's color was as white as her own coat, while Scootaloo was bright red. Considering this glaring difference in color, Cheerilee wondered how they could possibly mistake each other's helmets for their own anyway. They looked heroic and chivalrous compared to the two ponies on the other side of the table, which was exactly the idea. Silver Spoon's costume was pitch black, while Diamond Tiara's was a deep purple. The style of their costumes was likewise different from the two knights. They both wore something akin to a courtier's dress or a diplomat's gown than a warrior armor. Mean looks were being exchanged all over the table, and Cheerilee couldn't decide if they were trying to get into character or if the natural animosity of the Cutie Mark Crusaders towards the other two fillies were at work here. The only acting pony who wasn't on set yet was Snips. But then again, he wasn't even in the next scene. Cheerilee walked over to the left side of the stage and held the curtain aside for herself. The leader of the orchestra immediately spotted her as she emerged next to him, and raised an eyebrow questioningly. She nodded at him, and he nodded back, turning his attention towards the musicians, most of whom were friends or family of the actors. Cheerilee slipped back behind the curtains as she heard the first soft notes float through the air. By the time she went back in the center of the stage, the music had increased in volume and could be heard all throughout the theater. The conversation slowly died down, and everyone took their seats. Cheerilee looked up to see Snails, thankfully in the right spot between the stage lights, waving at her sheepishly. The ushers took their cue from the music, and slowly the lights in the theater hall died down. The pace of the music increased, and the feeling of anticipation intensified, until suddenly the curtain slid open a few feet, accompanied by the rolling of drums. She stepped forward past the curtains, and Snails turned on a spotlight and aimed it at her, bathing her in a circle of light as she moved. Despite the curtains being partly open, the darkness behind Cheerilee revealed nothing to the audience. The music stopped, and Cheerilee's voice took over, ringing out crystal clear throughout the enormous room due to the perfect acoustics.
Fillies and gentlecolts, it is with great pride that my students and I welcome you to our very own play. They have all worked so hard on this over the past few months, and we hope you will enjoy it as much as we enjoy bringing it to you. Of one thing I am certain, this will be an evening you won't soon forget.
Cheerilee smiled widely despite herself. It was just the kind of opening she thought everyone would expect. But she was certain the last part would turn out to be true in more ways than one.
And now, without further ado, I am proud to introduce, performed in Ponyville for the first time ever, Reginald the Sly.
The music exploded again during her last words as she disappeared behind the curtains, following to the right side of the stage as they slid open behind her. The music died down once again as the spotlight was turned off and the main stage lights were turned on, slowly illuminating the scene. Cheerilee could hear the play starting while she went down a set of stairs to get underneath the stage. The size of the stage itself was impressive, but the area underneath it was simply amazing. There were plenty of room to install all sorts of devices to spruce up any kind of play, and the stage itself was thick and well isolated enough that ponies could work down here without disturbing the actors on stage. She had once started banging a metal pipe against one of the iron stage supporters during the rehearsal, just to see if her students would hear it. They hadn't. She made her way in between the beams supporting the stage and the various props and gadgets that reached down from the stage, heading for the prompt corner. She finally arrived at a few wooden steps which took her to a level halfway between the stage and the area underneath it, so that only her head peeked above the stage level. From there, she could watch the stage from the same side as the audience, without actually being seen by the audience due to the way the prompt corner was built into the stage. From the audience point of view, it just looked like a slightly raised box. During some plays, a prompt would be set here to feed actors their lines if they forgot them, but the dialogue in this one wasn't overly complicated, and they had never rehearsed with the possibility of a prompt in mind. Cheerilee didn't think any of them would even realize she was there. She tried to pick up the thread of the play, since she had obviously missed some of it on her way down here. They seemed slightly further ahead than Cheerilee had expected, but she didn't know if this was because of them rushing or leaving something out, or if she was just walking slower than she had thought she had been. She shook her head. It didn't matter. This scene wasn't important to her. A grin spread across her face as she sat and watched, and waited for a scene that was. Applebloom slammed her hoof on the table as she dramatically looked first to the left of the table, then to the right.
All of this is meaningless. We still have to put a stop to this Reginald the Sly. And I don't care who does it, or how.
She said, trying her best to suppress her accent. She was most likely the one with the biggest grasp of the script, simply because sticking to her lines made avoiding her accent easier. As soon as she drifted from them even a bit, it was all over, and the accent was back in full swing. It sounded very odd out of the mouth of a king, to be sure.
But my king, I maintain that violence is not the answer.
Silverspoon said.
If you would just let your royal advisor and I work on a diplomatic solution, then I am sure that—
No!
The king cut her short.
Do you think I know not what goes on when I have my back turned? The two of you will stay right here. Sir Lancelot the Brave, I entrust this task to you. Find this villain and bring him back here so he may face my judgment.
She decreed as she leaned forward over the table, pointing her hoof at Cheerilee before banging it on the table again.
Just leave it to me. I'll bring him back kicking and screaming.
Cheerilee said as she raised her hoof enthusiastically, completely ignoring the script and the lines she should be using. Fortunately, it came down to much the same thing, which was probably the only reason the fillies couldn't hear Cheerilee gritting her teeth all the way out on stage. Cheerilee got up from her table and bowed before her king before taking a few steps away from the table and turning around. The lights went out for a short moment, and when they turned back on, only Cheerilee was on stage. The king's table was completely deserted, and less light was focused on the area before then. In addition to this, Cheerilee was now carrying a white lance around her, holding it under one of her wings. She started walking across the stage, taking a roundabout routes around some set props and pieces of decor.
These are the Wildlands, there's no doubt. So where could that Weasley Reginald be? I heard he's sly as a fox, and true as that may be, he'll never outwit the likes of me.
Speaking thusly, Sir Lancelot came up to a part of the stage that quite obviously represented a mountain with a mine entrance leading into it. The backdrop of the decor served as a mountain, while the shallow mine entrance was more of a little building on stage, and expertly made. A small hooded figure suddenly emerged on the scene, wearing black robes. His face was hidden by the hood, but anyone could deduce it was Snips, based on his height and the simple progress of elimination. The new arrival casually strolled down the same path Sir Lancelot was currently on, and it wasn't long before their paths crossed in front of the mine itself.
Halt! By order of the king, I, Sir Lancelot, have come to put an end to Reginald the Sly. Are you he?
Cheerilee said louder than was necessarily even during a play.
Oh no, noble knight. I am but a simple hermit living in the mountain yonder.
The robed figure replied as he motioned towards the mountains in the distance. Cheerilee scoffed at this and raised her chin.
A little thing such as you would indeed not have much of a challenge. You look like you could hardly stand upright during a gentle summer's breeze. Now tell me quick, simple soul. If I wish to find this Reginald, where should I go?
Ah, you are indeed fortunate, Sir Knight. The villain you seek has his lair in this very cave.
The robed pony motioned at the mine entrance with a nod of his head.
In there? You sure of this?
The brave knight asked as she peeped inside.
Of course! Would I lie? You might have to leave your lance behind, though. A lot of narrow passages down there.
The filly threw the stranger a few scrutinizing glances, and then looked straight into the audience and shrugged. She placed her lance against the rocks outside and approached the entrance.
If I don't find him in here, I'm coming back here to kick your flank.
Cheerilee said, again introspecting the script liberally. As soon as she stepped into the darkness, Snips sprang into motion and pulled the rock away to reveal an old-fashioned lever hidden there, not unlike those used to change the direction of train tracks.
Hey! It's a dead end in here! What are you playing at?
Cheerilee's voice came echoing from the inside of the mine. Upon hearing this, Snips pulled the lever into neutral position, and at once a metal gate slammed over the entrance to the mine. Cheerilee's helmeted head reappeared in the light as she looked at the metal bars in front of her with a fake astonishment, shaking them violently with her hooves.
What is this trickery? Let me out right this instant! or the justice of King Golden Crown shall come down upon your head, be whomever you may.
The hooded pony let out a diabolical laugh as he approached the metal gate, standing next to it as he addressed the knight, so that he may still roughly be facing the audience as well.
Be whoever I may? Why, you're thicker than I thought! You righteous fool! It is, of course, I, Reginald the Sly!
Snips announced as he drew back the hood to reveal himself.
Did you think I would not expect one of you to come here eventually? Or that I would not recognize the great Sir Lancelot, bravest of all the knights in the realm, when she arrived upon my doorstep? It is your courage that shall now be your undoing,
He continued, followed by more laughter. Sir Lancelot shook the metal gate some more and tried to lift it up, but she could not.
You devil! You heathen! You dishonorable wretch! When I get out of here, it'll be off with your head.
Reginald the Sly paused for a moment as he put both his hooves on the lever once more.
Then it is fortunate
He said menacingly.
that you will never get out of there ever again!
He pulled down, and suddenly a great rumbling could be heard throughout the theater as the orchestra kicked in with an impressive display of percussive instruments. Sir Lancelot, much like the audience, recoiled and looked around fearfully, taking a few steps backwards into the mine, thus disappearing out of sight. There was a loud crash as a cloud of smoke or dust erupted from the mine. Once it cleared out, the music died down. The audience could see the entrance of the cave again, but the opening behind the metal gate was now blocked by what appeared to be a wall of stone and rubble. Snips simply took the lance the knight had left behind between his teeth and walked off, as the stage lights gradually died down and the curtains closed. The audience remained silent for a moment, surprised by the sudden development, but then suddenly started talking amongst themselves about the events of the play so far. The only one who seemed to have anything bad to say about it was Rainbow Dash, who thought it was pure folly to kill off the character of the most talented actor in the group so soon. Cheerilee left her spot in the prompts corner and went back under the stage. She headed in the direction of a faint banging noise towards the part directly under the mine. She couldn't help but smile at the thought that everything she had worked for all of these months was finally about to pay off, and memories of how it had all started involuntarily flooded her mind.
And that's how Equestria was made.
Cheerilee concluded her little history lesson. She turned away from the blackboard to face the class, and was at once struck by how eerily unfamiliar the scene still felt, ever since the board had decided to change up the groups and put her in charge of the fillies and foals who needed extra attention. Things had been taking a turn for the worse. She was used to seeing students off at the end of the year and welcoming new ones back in the beginning for the next, of course. But despite that, getting a new group assigned to her out of the blue just didn't quite feel right.
Especially not this group.
Cheerilee thought as she gritted her teeth in pure frustration. It became at once clear that no filly or foal in the room had actually been listening to a word she had said, as per usual. Instead, Sweetiebelle and Scootaloo were having a hushed conversation, while Silverspoon and Dimetiara seemed to be more inclined to admiring each other's jewelry instead of concentrating on the lesson at hand. In the back row, Snips and Snails were laughing at something that could only ever be amusing to the likes of them. A smile suddenly crept onto Cheerilee's face as she noticed that there was, in fact, one single filly who seemed to be paying attention.
Oh, Applebloom, would you mind explaining the importance of the day-night cycle to your less attentive classmates?
Cheerilee asked as cheerfully as she could manage. To her great surprise and even greater annoyance, Applebloom seemed to veer up at the mere mention of her name, looking around the room somewhat panicky.
Oh, yeah, I suppose I can. Let's see here now.
Apple said as she scratched her head.
Night and day are important because, if there were only one or the other, either Luna or Celestia would be very sad.
She concluded with a smile, raising a hoof in a "that's right" gesture. Cheerilee gritted her teeth once again. Of course, the one filly who had been paying attention hadn't understood a word she'd said. As Cheerilee opened her mouth to formulate a chastising response, Scootaloo suddenly loudly interjected.
That's stupid. Really? Who could ever come up with a reason as ridiculous as that?
She pointed a hoof towards Applebloom.
I don't see you coming up with the better answer either. I bet you don't even know what you're talking about.
Applebloom retorted just as loudly as she crossed her hooves in front of her chest.
Oh yeah? Why did I get a better grade in that last test then?
We all know you cheated.
Did not.
Did so.
Did not.
Did so.
Did...
Girls!
Cheerilee shouted.
This is neither the time nor the place to hold such pointless debates. You're here to learn and pay attention. And that goes for all of you. Yes, you too, Diamond Tiara. Don't look so surprised.
She paused one moment as she met the gaze of every filly and foal in turn, as they were finally quiet for once.
I had thought the topic of today's class would be exceedingly interesting to young ponies who, like you all, witnessed Princess Luna's return, a major historical event that shed much light on our country's history and origins.
Oh yeah.
Applebloom chimed in.
She was stuck on the moon for 1,000 years, right?
The moon?
Scootaloo snorted.
That's impossible. Not even Rainbow Dash could fly that high. Besides, what would she eat for 1,000 years? The moon doesn't exactly look grassy from where I'm standing.
At this, Applebloom remained uncharacteristically silent, as she pondered the question.
She could just eat cheese, right? The moon's made of that stuff.
Scootaloo rolled her eyes as she planted her own hoof against her forehead.
The moon is not made of cheese.
Oh, it is so.
Ahem.
Came a more serene voice from beside the two, as Sweetie Belle moved her head closer to the pair.
I'm sorry, Applebloom, but I have to agree with Scootaloo here. The moon can't be made out of cheese.
By this point, the other fillies and foals had pretty much reverted to their own activities again, as Cheerilee stood softly bumping her head against the blackboard, completely at a loss about how in the hay she could get through to these fillies. She stopped doing so as she heard Sweetie Belle's calm voice, and her ears rose up as she listened. Perhaps at least one of them had some sense in her yet.
It can't be made out of cheese,
Sweetie Belle stated confidently.
because if it was, Luna had eaten that huge hole in it by now.
Oh yeah.
Avalon said as comprehension drawn in her eyes.
I suppose that makes sense.
No!
Cheerilee screamed as she turned around.
It does not! It does not make any sense at all. The moon isn't made out of cheese because... Ugh. You know what? Forget it. Class dismissed. You all have the rest of the day off. Go!
She pointed wildly at the door, not trusting herself to be able to keep calm in the company of these impossible foals and fillies for even another moment longer. She thought she might start breaking things if this went on. All the foals and fillies in the classroom quickly got up from their desks, nearly galloping out for the door.
What's up with her?
Scootaloo asked as soon as they got out of the room, but when they were still within earshot of Cheerilee.
Meh, I don't even know.
Appleton said as she shrugged. They suddenly heard the telltale sound of shattering glass coming from the classroom behind them. They both looked back over their shoulders, looked at each other, shrugged, and continued on their way. Cheerilee paced up and down the length and width of her living room relentlessly. Pieces of splintered wood covered the floor, starting at where her table had been and trailing all the way up to the kitchen, where you could just make out the rough outline of what had once been one of her table legs. Shards of porcelain and hardened clay were sprinkled around, and the place just generally looked like a hurricane had swept through it. or two. Cheerilee stopped pacing around for a moment, but only so she could aim a few well-placed kicks at the remaining pieces of furniture in the room.
Why? Why can't I get these ponies to behave?
She screeched in frustration. And this, in fact, lay the very center of the issue. Ever since she had earned her cutie mark, she had been able to bring out the best in ponies and watch them blossom, watch them grow. Yet here were a bunch of foals and fillies she had been working on for over 6 months, and they hadn't learned anything. Not a single thing. It ate at her confidence and kept her up at night. She lay twisting and turning as she wondered if she was losing her edge, if she had lost her gift. She had spent countless hours at the library Twilight Sparkle tended to, under the guise of looking for reading material that might interest her students. When Twilight noticed that she had been looking mostly at books covering the subject of cutie marks, Cheerilee had told her that she was interested in alleviating the concerns 3 of her pupils had, the self-proclaimed cutie mark crusaders. But that wasn't true. The real reason was one question constantly on Cheerilee's mind.
Can a cutie mark be mistaken? Is it possible that I never was as good at teaching as I thought I was? That I simply had easy foals and fillies to work with before? Or if a cutie mark is accurate at the time it manifests, can it perhaps grow inaccurate over time?
These questions and many more like it slowly pushed Cheerilee down into an all-encompassing feel of depression. She found her patience wearing increasingly thin and lost faith in herself more and more. It became hard to get up in the morning, and harder still to bring herself to return to the classroom where she knew they would be waiting, to turn another day into a living hell. For the last few nights she had been laying awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to just let it all go. At times like that, she would sometimes tilt her head to look at the glimmering steel of the knife she had put on her nightstand, just in case she ever found a brief moment of courage she needed to. Cheerilee walked over to the huge standing mirror in the corner of the living room, which, surprisingly enough, remained intact. She looked at the reflection of her cutie mark in the mirror. Those faces, those smiling faces seemed to laugh at her, mock her, belittle her for ever having the audacity to think that she was good at something, good at anything.
No!
Cheerilee yelled as she bucked her hind legs hard at the mirror, her hooves shattering it into 1,000 pieces, which joined the mess on the floor. Cheerilee's eyes twitched slightly as she panted and stared out her window into her wild and overgrown garden. Normally, it'd be neatly trimmed and filled with beautiful flowers this time of the year, but with her increasing moments of depression and lethargy, not to mention all the trips to the library, she had not been able to tend to her garden as much as she would liked. Vines and weeds choked the budding flowers she had planted long ago, suffocating them and slowly squeezing the life out of their growth. She stared at her garden, and then at her cutie mark, and then at her garden once more. And suddenly it all became clear to her. It all made sense. It was not that she wasn't a good teacher. Oh no. She had a gift. A great gift. She had always had it, and she hadn't lost it. She would never lose it. But her garden, her class, was overgrown by vines and weeds. Weeds that had to be purged from it if flowers were ever to bloom again. Vines that had to be cut down and pulled out, root and all, if she were to take her responsibilities as a teacher seriously. She quietly sat staring out of her window as night fell. The stars and the moon barely illuminated the darkness enough for her to see. She thought about what she should do next, what she could do. She realized the plans she was making were for the best and would eventually save more lives than they would ruin. But some ponies, most notably the families of the weeds she had identified, might not see it the same way. They wouldn't be able to comprehend the truth of the matter, not in the way she did. So she need to be subtle, she need to be crafty, and yet something inside of her didn't want all this to go down quietly in the night. She desired a show. She desired a spectacle. She wanted to show everyone in Ponyville once and for all what a great teacher she was, and to assure them that she could deal with any problem that might come up during their fillies and foals education, even if the filly or foal in question was the problem. She struggled with these seemingly contradictory goals for a while, before finally receiving yet another epiphany, another glorious idea.
I think...
She whispered quietly in the dark as she slowly grasped the knife from the nearby nightstand and held it up in the light of the moon.
It's time for another school play.
She started giggling as all her fears, doubts, and other dark emotions burst forth in a vortex of madness. She snatched up a picture frame from the desk next to her. The picture it contained had been taken just earlier that month. It was the obligatory teacher with her class photograph they made every year. She took it out of the frame and lit one of the candles in the room, surprised that she still had one that wasn't too broken. As the little flame illuminated the room, she carefully held the picture in it. The flame burned brighter and started to consume the picture, licking at the hooves of the foals and fillies whose image had been captured on it. And for the first time in 6 months, Cheerilee couldn't stop smiling.